it's not clear how to behave in this space, in this environment. We know how to behave in a park, in a public park. And although we violate some rules, we are fully aware of what the consequences will be. We also know how to behave in a private backyard. But what to do in these backyards? Well, that's an interesting question which will be answered by the next presenter. So the deficit of the space in the Soviet residential areas, which will be given by Mother Laure, who's another master student of the Academy of Arts, but she has background in architecture, so that most probably allows her to have a structured. Now had been already introduced, but I would like to repeat that I'm Mother Laure, and the full presentation has been, or the full text has been published on a webpage of the Riga or Chief Architect's webpage, and I'll try to sort of briefly go through this article. However, if you're interested in the article, please go to the webpage, and there are some time constraints that I have to take into account, so I'll have to skip some parts of my article. So the key topic I would like to talk about is the public space. So I would like to ask you, how many of you are coming from the residential areas yourselves? Can you please raise your hands? Well, quite many. What I can say about myself is that I'm also a tenant or living in a residential area, and I also belong to, as has been mentioned by previous presenters, that I'm, belonging to the youth, or those 5% that are not really happy with the environment or the space that the residential areas have to offer. So, like most of you, the reason like most of you know, or think the reason why so many people are satisfied is that they just don't have anything to compare it with. So they're not aware of their options. That's why they think it's satisfactory. So for me, as an architect, I'm forced to think, what it's like an elephant in the room. Nobody really mentions a pink elephant in the room, and which nobody mentions. And those who don't belong to the architectural circles, and they think that it's very easy to revitalize or revamp or change these residential areas, just to change the facades and bring in some amenities, and people will be happy. But that's not so. So I would like to therefore oppose this view. Let me first start by defining what's a public space. So what a public space is. So basically public space is what I am really missing living in a residential area compared to other places where I've lived, like for example Old Town and smaller towns that I've lived, or Pārdaugava, where I've lived. To me, a public space is an environment where people are keen to spend their time, and if I can borrow a quote from a Danish urban planner and theoretician and architect Jan Gehl, a public space, if it functions well, it doesn't really matter what kind of architecture surrounds it. So if these residential areas would be designed and built to ensure quality public space, we wouldn't have to worry about the boring architecture and ugly houses. But that's not so. And public space is important because of two reasons. Because of social networks or social contacts it allows to create. And this, is an answer to the question why people live or choose to live in cities instead of countryside. Social networking is one of the factors that drives people towards cities. We like generally other people. And safety is also another reason. When the cities emerged initially in ancient times, the city gave a protection against intruders coming from the outside. Whereas today, the sense or the feeling of safety is generated by the various opportunities that a city can offer. So this public space is, in a way, a safety valve, if you will. I mean, this is some kind of social control mechanism in order to avoid overcrowding of people in certain places. If people flock to certain places in big numbers, you have to behave. So people are watching you from their windows, and you have to behave if you're in a public space, in a public environment. And going back to the Riga Technical University research and its results, it has already been presented in the first session. However, I also took two sort of numbers or figures from this research which seem relevant or important for me, since they vividly indicate that a public space in a residential area virtually does not exist. 78% do not know who their neighbors are, and 63% think that their area is unsafe. Are the two figures that I wanted to mention. So there is a question, what about the 22% who know who their neighbors are? So most probably those are people who have been living there for a couple of decades, for quite a long time, who know each and every neighbor, personally, individually. And that also ties in nicely with the theory that there is a disbalance in these areas, this balance between the public and private. In other words, you can be friends with neighbors, you can be friends with neighboring families, but you don't really have an environment or space where to just meet each other, greet each other, and, find out basically who your neighbors are and see whether they are positive towards you. Whether they have positive attitudes towards you. So the reason why they don't know their neighbors is probably that they haven't met them, or they've met them, a couple of times only. It's very difficult to, know your neighbor if you meet him or her only once or twice a year in staircase. So this public and private balance between the private and public is basically the root of all the security concerns or safety concerns. The things that could settle themselves need to be settled or regulated by the municipal police or other police, and this is what I very vividly feel in the area that I live in. The violation of private space is often requiring intervention of the police. So why are people reluctant to use the public space in residential areas in Riga? Why don't they use it if it's available? Well, the answer to this question is a bit more complicated than it may seem to you initially, because we must also, and I'll sort of be telling things that architects know already, but this is for those who don't know it, I mean for laymen. So what concerns the history of public spaces, in a historic traditional sense or urban environment, public spaces emerge or evolve naturally. In the medieval times, nobody planned specifically for public spaces. So people had, reasons to be outside all the time, outdoors all the time, on various squares and so on and so forth. That was because these spaces offered different functions. I mean, typical building was, shopping area, the first floor, and then the other floors for the apartments. So there were people in the streets constantly because of work or, just going shopping. So then came the 20th century with its different approach to functionality, and basically they were trying to tackle the problems stemming from rapid urbanization, widespread urbanization. So, and also manufacturing changed. Previously, there were some small manufacturers or workshops at home where people were producing, whereas now the factories were the place where people were working, and that meant that people need to have decent homes, fresh air and green grass, and that was a very good way to solve the urbanization problem by providing the green patches or green space in between the buildings. Unfortunately, some of the problems have been solved. Nevertheless, these solutions were at the cost of other things. Quite quickly, the world realized that this utopian dream, this utopian social dream doesn't work really, because the distance between houses is too big, and you can't really use this space, but Soviet Union was very keen to adopt the ideas of functionality and split function approach, that you have a residential area and nearby you have a manufacturer where people work or a plant where people work, because apart from economical reasons, from an ideological point of view, it was just convenient to put those residential houses freely instead of using traditional urban planning approaches. They were basically, located or put it aside from the other areas. And another reason was that, to sort of help the people living in this residential area to move around. The transportation is conveniently located in the nearest vicinity, so there are no people wandering around, no people gathering around. They have the purpose and they just go wherever needed, and they move around very efficiently. And Arganska and Priedz was the first of such areas built in Riga, and Plavnik was the last built, and I spent my first 3 years of life there, but I don't remember anything from Plavnik. Anyhow, one of the examples from around the world is the Ego area in St. Louis, the United States, which basically is a good example of how the rest of the world dealt with the functionalism ideas, and they got rid of them earlier than we did. And it existed for some 15 years. In 1957 it was built, in 1972 it was demolished. Well, they had to demolish, and the mere reason for demolishing it was that social problems aggravated to the extent or to the level at which municipality was finding it hard to handle these problems. And so they basically just decided to demolish the project. And I'm not suggesting to do the same with the residential areas in Riga, because 60% of our people are living there. So basically they will be then, removed from their homes if we demolish them. But what I wanted to say by this is that there is a shift of paradigm, if you will, in urban planning and architecture camp. Charles Channing, for example, said that this demolishing was a sort of a death of the modern architecture, in a way. And then, thanks to this, all around Western Europe, nobody really continued building residential areas. An entirely different picture we can see in the Eastern Europe, in the post-Soviet area, where development of residential areas continued and probably still continues these days. Now, what concerns these residential areas, there was an interesting thing that I found out researching about these residential areas. In 1960s, these areas were out of scale, so they were so the scale was criticized heavily by the architects, and the layout of this area that you can see from the bird's eye view, but you can't see it from the ground level, is, wrong. And then here I've compared a place where I live with the Dome Square in the old town. So the width of my yard is 70 meters, and the width of the Dome Square is the same with the Riga Bourse Museum and other buildings. And it's obvious to me that only by facilitating this square, nothing really will be achieved, especially looking at the number of the summer or outdoors or open cafes that you have during the summer on the Dome Square to sort of inhabit this area. And this is, well, my yard that I referred to. What could you do there, Even though we would have swings in the middle or benches in the middle, that wouldn't be enough, really, to attract or lure the people in. And architects understood that very, very early on, and in 1967 there was a survey which concluded that only 37% are using the green patches or areas for recreational needs. And today it's no different. And I belong to those 26% that are not using the backyard at all. I don't know what kind of facilities or amenities it should have for me to go there. That is again the data coming from the Riga Technical University research. What's important to me is that 35% are using the yard only to park their car. To me, it seems that it's out of proportion because and at the same time, it's not the majority, so probably we shouldn't sort of guide ourselves by what they need. You can see here, that it's mainly parked cars in the yards. But the problem is that these parking lots are just by the entrance or the main door of the building. And the main door or the entrance is where people usually sort of concentrate or where they meet each other. And we could find a better use for these entrance doors, but at the moment the cars are parked in front. And the yards are big enough, to accommodate the cars from all over the world, or in other words, many cars. And, there are very good examples around us. Salisbury is not so far from Riga, where you can sort of draw a demarcation line or somehow segregate the parking area from the walking area. And this is a picture from my backyard as well. And here you can see that, this environment is very cozy and comfortable, and it has the potential to be used. We just need to think about its development.
What we see here is a classical entry detail of the series 602. And another thing that one would have to think about this is the tidying up of these entrance details. Also, in regard to the renovation and thermal insulation of buildings, we'd have to think about meeting the requirements of universal design. And what you see here is an approach to solving this question. Since the premises are small, they can be increased. This would in turn give us opportunities for articulating the facade. And another thing that it might provide would be connecting new volumes. The current building standards do not permit for that because the current requirements provide for 20 to 30 meters long longitudinal facade and 10 to 15 for the side facades. But maybe potentially this would enable to tackle the problem of the courtyards, because currently no architects understand what to do with them. Maybe the center of the courtyard could be the parking lot. During the last couple of years, many construction works have been carried out in courtyards. The main problem related to this is the fact that the construction has taken place by the same spirit as before. So one can't really claim that the new projects would have positively contributed to the development of these outdoor spaces, because these are the same types of buildings, but simply they look a bit nicer. Another thing is the buildings that were built in the courtyards of the existing buildings, because they don't really tend to cooperate with the existing building. They instead try to shape this isolated communities, and that's why many. Since the, so to say, the boom years, it was prohibited to build something. Regardless of how well this looks in advertising booklets, it is very difficult to name these spaces as publicly accessible. And finally, I would like to provide you with my conclusions. The conclusions are as follows. The city and the legislators of the city would have to define guidelines for locating parking lots in many districts, as well as environmental solutions or requirements for renovating buildings. No one else will do this. And the next thing in terms of importance would be the requirements for amenities and landscaping in courtyards. What I would like to finish my speech with is that it might seem utopical that to think that it is possible to reconstruct or reshape courtyards in a different way, but on the other hand, it is also easy for these courtyards to collapse one beautiful day. Thank you. Thank you.
Paldies, Madara.